My name is Arno Michaelis. I was a white nationalist skinhead, a lead singer in a neo-Nazi metal band. This is everything I'm authorized to tell you. The most formative years of my life, I was just immersed in this hate and violence. I was actually at a neo-Nazi rally in Michigan where about 50 of us brawled with like 500 anti-fascists, and there were all too many times when we would jump people and just beat the hell out of them. I've done a lot of harm to innocent people and to society, and I need to be accountable for that harm. What attracted me to neo-Nazi ideology initially was really the hero story. I grew up being a big fan of fantasy and mythology. I was really into Greek myths and Norse myths as a kid. The mythology of Nazi ideology, going back to Adolf Hitler, was that we are these Aryan supermen, the brightest of all creation, that are under assault by these dark, evil hordes. And here we are fighting back against them, against incredible odds, but with incredible strength. It was very much the same kind of mystique that you would find in a Lord of the Rings movie or a Conan book. And for me, this was like my chance to actually be that hero on this noble quest. And then as I got more into it and took in more and more of the ideology, a lot of that ideology was about like, look how evil and horrible they are, and look how good and noble my people are. Look at all these great things we have done despite all the challenges and despite being under assault by everybody else. There was actually a music distribution outfit in Chicago called Romantic Violence. And those two words sum up the entire ideology better than anything I could say at length. There's a romance to it. It makes you feel like you're a hero and you're doing something good for your people. As you get further into the ideology, it's all about pseudoscience, about how whites are superior to everybody else, all kinds of nonsense about the size of our brains and IQ. And then, of course, all of this is deeply rooted in anti-Semitism. The entire ideology is based on seeing Jews as the root of all evil on the planet Earth. That's the core of the neo-Nazi belief, is that the white race is this, first of all, it exists. You have to have some kind of idea of who's white and who's not. And again, that was never firmly established by anything. I remember meeting Italian skinheads. There was one crew that their leader was an Armenian guy who looked like he was straight out of Iraq or something. And I said, "What are you, Italian?" He's like, "Oh, I'm Armenian. Hitler had Armenian SS units." And I was like, all right, well, if it was good enough for Hitler, it's good enough for me. The most damaging aspect of the neo-Nazi ideology is definitely the fear. Anybody who does look like you and doesn't think like you, they're not only an enemy, they're the highest order of enemy. They're a race traitor. So it's this experience of going through every waking moment of your day thinking that everyone else in the world is not only out to kill you personally, but out to destroy everyone who looks like you. And it's a miserable way to live that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I tattooed a swastika on my own leg, which I've since had covered up. I had a swastika on my middle finger for a time, cleverly, so I could show it to someone before I hit them. The other symbolism we used, there was any kind of Norse ruin. Just like Hitler did, we co-opted the Norse folk religion and kind of made it into this white nationalist thing, which is, along with pretty much everything else in the ideology, is incredibly historically inaccurate, because the Vikings they killed people who looked like them, and they had peaceful trade and diplomatic relationships with North Africa and the Middle East. There's a lot of lingo to neo-Nazi movement. The first one I learned was '88. When I met the Chicago skinhead crew, a lot of them had sports jerseys on that had '88 as the number. The 8th letter of the alphabet is H. So 88 means Heil Hitler. So it's code for Heil Hitler. In the mid-'80s, there was a really dangerous militant white nationalist terror group called the Order, or the Bruderschweigen, and they assassinated a Jewish talk show host. They were doing all kinds of things to like fund a race war before they were ultimately taken down. But one of the members of the Order, who was in prison for life and unrepentant, he decided we needed some sort of like slogan, like some catchy mantra that the movement could use to unite us and inspire us. So he came up with the 14 words, which are, we must secure the existence of our race and a future for white children. So to this day, if you're looking at a social media handle, if you see the numbers 14 and 88, that's a good indicator that it's a white nationalist account. There were ways to identify as either a white power or an anti-racist skinhead, and it was typically involved the color of the laces in your boots and or the color of your braces that you wore. If you were a neo-Nazi, you'd have red laces, red braces. Anti-racist skinheads would sometimes wear white laces, although some people would say white laces are white pride, so they'd wear like yellow laces or anything but the red laces. And then, of course, beyond that, obviously, if you see someone with a swastika patch, a white power skinhead's typically going to have outright white supremacist symbols all over their body and tattoos and or patches on a jacket, whereas the anti-racist skinheads would also have like anti-fascist patches and things like that. Hammerskin Nation began in the southern United States, specifically Dallas, Texas. There was a skinhead gang in Dallas who took the crossed hammers from Pink Floyd The Wall, and they put them in front of a Confederate flag, and it looked really cool. And they said, they just called themselves, we're the Hammerskins. This was right about the same time that my gang in Milwaukee was starting. In 1988, one of the lead members of the Confederate Hammerskins in Dallas, Texas, came up to Milwaukee, and he pitched the idea to us that we become Northern Hammer Skinheads. And the Hammerskins were born. Despite the hypocrisy of using a symbol from a band that considers themselves very anti-fascist, we had no problem appropriating that crossed hammer logo. And in our case, we put it on a field of U.S. flag blue with 13 stars around the hammers to signify the Northern Hammerskins. And very shortly afterwards, there were Northern Hammer chapters in Chicago and St. Paul and Detroit and Ohio. And while this was happening, there were more Confederate Hammerskin groups popping up all over the South. Now, down south, there was a lot of crossover between the Ku Klux Klan and the Hammerskins. There was a lot of like old school Klansmen who were very happy to see this wellspring of youth coming into their movement, and they were okay to stomach the tattoos and the punk rock music in the process. So there were a number of Confederate Hammer skinheads who were also members of Ku Klux Klan groups at the time. When I was involved in Hammerskin Nation, there was really no centralized command. Every group operated individually. It was really just, well, we use the same symbol. We're all racist anti-Semites. We're all violent drunks. We all love this music. And those were the real unifying factors behind it. As I was leaving, people started having titles, and there started to be an attempt at having some sort of structure about how the group was going to work. And to varying degrees, that was followed as Hammerskin Nation spread to Europe, to Australia, to New Zealand, even to Argentina and South Africa. In our group in Milwaukee, we didn't have any kind of official structure. We didn't have titles. We had just unofficial kind of organic hierarchy the same way a wolf pack would. There's certainly alphas and they certainly run things, but they're not voted. They don't have titles. That's just how it is. I wasn't the sole alpha leader. I was one of a number. We weren't really conscious of this. It was just kind of how it went. If we were going to make a decision about something, it would be me and the other alphas talking about it. And once we decided on whatever that was, that's how it was. And everybody else could follow along or they could get the hell out. That was basically how things worked. I don't know that Hammerskin Nation is as much of a thing as it used to be. There are groups like the Proud Boys. At their peak, the Proud Boys were like the modern manifestation of Hammerskin Nation, even though there was very significant differences, namely that the Proud Boys' official leader was a Latino man, and that would have never happened in Hammerskin Nation. But other than that, they were a street brawling, kind of street fighter-oriented group. And I think a lot of Hammerskin Nation people, if they didn't grow out of it, which most of them do, honestly, they may have found themselves affiliated with groups like the Proud Boys. Recruiting a neo-Nazi was 2 steps, basically. The first step was to get this kid to identify as white. Typically, if I have an archetype called Joe Pissed Off White Kid. If I'm talking to Joe Pissed Off White Kid, the first thing I have to do is convince him that he's a white man, and that's how he should identify himself. In the late 80s, most people racialized as white didn't identify themselves as white. If I asked Joe who he was, he would say, I'm American. My family's Catholic. We're Democrats or Republicans, whatever. There's going to be all sorts of ways that they identify themselves other than racially. So I have to stop him in his tracks and be like, listen, white man, whether you like it or not, the enemies of our people identify you as white. You don't have a choice about that. And the white race is under attack. If you don't join us and fight back, we're all going to be wiped out. I have to get that across to this kid, and he has to buy into it before I can proceed to step 2, which is to make him feel persecuted because he's white. In the late 80s, it was much more difficult to do that than it is today. In the late 80s, we didn't have all this talk of white privilege and white fragility and open talk saying, well, everything wrong with the world is basically white people's fault. Back in the 80s, it was just much more amorphous. We're all human beings. We have all these different ways of identifying ourselves. It wasn't like codified into racial groups like it is today. So I had to concoct things about how white people are oppressed. And once I could get him to buy into that he is white and he's oppressed because of it, now he's a white nationalist. Now he's a neo-Nazi. Now he's ready to come up to our drinking hall, get drunk with us, and get beat up. Though that was the recruitment process that we went through back in the day. If you're a teenager who has a history of trauma in your family, if you're living in poverty, if whatever you have going wrong, the more things wrong you have, the more openings there are for neo-Nazi ideology to take hold. And so that was how we recruited these kids, was we blamed all their problems on Jews. And then they said, if you join us, we're going to fight back against that. And we're going to take our country back and take our lands back and everything. And you'll have all sorts of women crawling all over you. You'll be a white warrior. It'll be great. If you were a new guy in the crew, you needed to prove yourself and prove that you could hang with us. And the first way to do that would be by wrestling with us in our wherever we're drinking. If you can't handle that, which many people couldn't. There were a lot of guys who would be there for one night, they'd get the snot knocked out of them, they're okay, I'm done with this, they wouldn't come back. But for the guys who did come back, and they're like, yeah, let's do that again. That was fun. Like, okay, now we know this is a viable candidate here. And again, this was very organic and it just happened. It wasn't like a policy, it wasn't something, oh, hey, congratulations for surviving, getting your kicked last night, you're in. It was more like, okay, if you like that, then let's do more of it. If you don't like it, get the hell out. The bulk of our recruits were men. It's interesting now because I work at Parents for Peace and we address all sorts of violent extremism. And there is a specific type of violent extremism called incel nowadays, which are men who call themselves involuntarily celibate. And they're angry because they don't have girlfriends. In my day, as in today, the typical #1 complaint for Joe Pissed Off White Kid is he doesn't have a girlfriend. and he's angry about it. The thing is that there were women in our movement, but it was at least 7 or 8 to 1 as far as men to women ratio went. So there weren't a lot of women to go around. And typically the few women that were involved in the movement were all with the alpha guys. So the alpha guys all had hot girlfriends, and Joe Pissed Off White Kid sees this and he's not doing the math, and he's like, well, that's what I want. So I'm going to do what this guy says because then I'll get that too. Never mind that there's not a whole lot of women out there. I actually had one guy in my crew who dipped his toes in and left. When I was interviewing him for my book, I said, well, why did you leave? And he's like, dude, it's really hard to get laid when you're a neo-Nazi. Like, chicks aren't into that, man. That's not attractive. And that was his big motivator to leave. He's like, I wanted girls, man, and they're not into that. So that dynamic was really front and center in our recruiting and really in everything that happened in that group. Milwaukee, where I was from, is the most segregated city in the United States for many years running. And what that means for neo-Nazi groups is it's very easy to point at these severely depressed inner city areas and go, see, that's what happens. That's what they do. Those people create these neighborhoods. That's completely ignorant of the truth that all the ghettos in the United States were created by government policy. And because of being segregated and sequestered to these incredibly hyper-compressed inner city areas, that's what created those ghettos. It wasn't the people who lived there. But of course, no white nationalist is going to admit that. No neo-Nazi is going to look at the true driving factors of poverty and addiction and crime in our country. Instead, they're going to make a leap of logic and say it's the color of the skin of the people who live there that create these conditions, not the actual policies that did. We were terrified to go to the inner city of Milwaukee. We knew if we went there looking for trouble, we'd probably get shot. So instead, we went to a more posh part of town where like frat boys would hang out. We went there looking for anti-racist skinheads because that's typically where they would hang out. And if we found them, we'd chase them down and beat them up. In Milwaukee, we couldn't get a proper fight with them. So quite often we'd pile into vans and drive out to Minneapolis, or we'd drive down to Chicago where there was a lot more anti-racist skinheads and we could count on a good fight with them. A lot of times if it was late and there weren't a lot of people on the street and we saw a lone target of opportunity, which would basically be anyone that we didn't like, which was everyone but us. But if it was a person of color, or if it was someone that we thought was gay or Jewish or a punk rocker, like that was all the better. And there were all too many times when we would jump people in those circumstances and just beat the hell out of them. We called it a boot party. If it was like 10 of us booting one guy, that was a boot party. We'd throw him a boot party. And my stomach turns when I think about that violence that I've engaged in. But that happened quite often. Just as often, we'd run into larger groups. A lot of times we would go to bars where there was just a few of us and we'd piss off somebody at the bar and end up fighting the whole bar. That happened a lot as well. Our main targets for violence and our main rivals were self-proclaimed anti-racist skinheads. It's important to understand that when the skinhead counterculture arose back in the 60s in the UK, it was working class kids, typically football hooligans. They'd go to soccer matches, they'd brawl the opposing team, but it wasn't racist from the get-go. There were immigrants from Pakistan and the West Indies who were all among the original skinheads. It wasn't until the 70s when the National Front, an outright fascist group in England, saw the potential amongst the white skinheads that the offshoot of racist skinheads arose. In the mid to late 80s, when the white power skinhead movement was kind of sweeping the United States, there were more traditional skinheads who stood up and said, hey, that's not what skinhead's about. what we now know as Antifa started back then with groups called SHARP. It was Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. So SHARPs were our favorite target as well. And then there was also another group called Anti-Racist Action. I was actually at a neo-Nazi rally in Michigan where about 50 of us brawled with like 500 anti-fascists. And that was a real like formative moment in my path from just being a drunken hooligan to being like a militant racist. There was a time we were walking down a street in a posh area very late at night, and we saw an Afro-American kid on his own, and somebody just walked up to him and said, "Oh, look, N-bomb." And we all just swarmed on him and just started punting him. That will haunt me to my grave, and it should. It was a horrible thing to do. But that happened fairly often. Even though we were really out looking for the baldies, if we didn't find the baldies and someone else was in the way, they were the ones who were going to get it. At the same time, many of the people that I beat up were just like random white dudes, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I had no idea who they were. I would try to rationalize it afterwards that he was a race traitor and that's why he got beat up. But it was really just that I was addicted to that violence the same way as I'm addicted to the hate, and I needed a fix. I felt bad while I was in the movement. I had this inner voice going, "What the hell are you doing? This guy didn't do anything to you. You don't even know who this guy is." I didn't have the courage to even acknowledge that voice, much less answer those questions. Aside from the fights and my bands, my main activity in the group was I did a lot of networking with other white nationalist groups. So we'd get road trips organized, and quite often also it would involve rallies. When you're having a white power rally, you obviously want as many people as you can get there. Therefore, that's when you flex that network and you're in Detroit and you're reaching out to the guys in Milwaukee and Chicago and St. Paul and Columbus and be like, "Hey guys, everybody come to Michigan, we're gonna have this rally." So you can go from 10 to 50 people instead of just being out there with 10 people. My personal role in a lot of these rallies was making the contacts, and I was the means that my crew was invited through. They would contact me and I would get my crew together and bring them out there. Really the most transformative event I was involved in was that neo-Nazi rally in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There was a group in Ann Arbor called like the SS Action Group. They were dressed up like the SS, and actually we thought they were pretty comical, but we liked that they were Nazis and we liked that they were shocking people and scaring people, so we were happy to travel there from Milwaukee and join in on that rally. I remember we packed about 50 people into a big 26-foot U-Haul and left from the guy's house, which was in a really depressed part of Detroit. And as we got there, I could see the grin on the face of the leader guy. They had like motorcycle helmets on too, and they handed out these big shields that were made from stolen stop signs. In the truck, a guy was going around with a big sack full of used batteries, and he's going around with it. I'm like, "What's that for?" He's like, "You can throw them at the Reds." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." So I got a couple pockets full of these batteries. As soon as we arrived, the truck's being pelted with bricks, and it's just thundering all over the place. The back door opens, and we see this huge roaring crowd of 500 people that are, I just remember, bloodthirsty. My ironic thought was like, wow, they really hate us. Look how much they hate us. So there's all this glass raining down on us and bricks coming at us from the crowd, and we're whipping the batteries at them from behind our shields and like holding up the shield to keep bricks from hitting us. When the truck first opened, I was terrified, but as soon as I pulled it out, like the adrenaline started pumping, and I was like, all right, let's go, this is it. And I was ready to just wade into that crowd and fight for the life of me until it was over. This went on probably 5-10 minutes before the cops were like, all right, you guys get the hell out of here. And driving back from that rally, I was just like basking in my own righteousness and in the importance of our cause. I was like, that's what we're up against. And it was very important that I had this visceral mob to experience, to be like, yeah, that's it. That was one of the things that when I would have my own misgivings and go, hey, this is messed up what we're doing, I would remember that rally and remember the Antifa and say, no, that's why we're right. That's why we have to keep doing what we're doing. All of us had menial, low-paying jobs, and we were pissed off about it. And that was certainly a driver of the violence we were committing. As far as my group was concerned, we self-funded everything. And it wasn't easy. We would have meetings every week. We'd call it our hall. That cost like $500 a month or so. About like 40 of us chipped in for that. And so we'd all chip in to pay the rent on our place. When we'd go on these road trips, we'd all chip in for gas. We became involved with a group called the Church of the Creator that published a monthly newspaper called Racial Loyalty. And they had a bit of money behind them, and they would basically send you as many of these racial loyalty papers as you could handle. And so we would get boxes and boxes and boxes of this racist newspaper. And we decided we're going to go into white neighborhoods and we're going to put this newspaper in every mailbox or on every door. And we would have meetings every Sunday. This is when we were starting to become more organized. And at these Sunday meetings, the Church of the Creator had a book called The White Man's Bible, and we read, and mind you, the Church of the Creator was vehemently atheist. We despised Christianity. It was really only called a church so we wouldn't have to pay taxes. But we would read a Bible passage, and then at the end of that, we would go around the group and we'd say, Arno, what have you done for the white race this week? And I would have to tell, I distributed 600 racial loyalties, or I brought in 3 new members to our group. And if you did something, everybody would go, yay, you get a big cheer. And if they came around to you and they said, Arno, what have you done for the white race this week? And I'd be like, I got drunk, I got in a fight. Everybody would go, boo! You'd be shunned and shamed and really like motivated to go out there and hand out those newspapers the next week. The name Church of the Creator, when it says creator, it doesn't mean some supernatural force. It sees the white race as the creator of all noble things in human history. Their founder was an old man who made a bunch of money with some kind of can opener patent in the 40s, and then he parlayed that into real estate. To us, anybody who was making over minimum wage was rich. But like this guy was rich to us, and he had, I don't know if he was a millionaire, multimillionaire, whatever, but he had enough money to fund all these magazines or the newspapers being printed and distributed. So, but again, he was doing that out of his pocket. In Otto, North Carolina is where the Church of the Creator compound was, and there was an actual church. As far as groups being involved in drug trafficking, I'd hear things from, the crews out west sell crystal meth. And later on in my current work, I know of Ku Klux Klan members who were involved in meth trafficking. It wasn't something they wanted people to know about, but it was going on. I know there were groups out west that were involved in drug trafficking. And then like my group is, while we lived and breathed alcohol every single day, we openly shunned every other drug on earth, and we would have never openly done them, much less trafficked them. And so when we heard that crews out west were selling crystal meth to fund their groups, we're like, they're not Hammerskins. And issues like that caused fractions that led to the entire thing kind of splintering. I knew a man who was on methamphetamine and in the Klan. They were all dealing to each other and to other white people in their communities. It's interesting because one of the reasons we cited to not get involved with drugs was that doing so inevitably connected you with non-whites. The entire existence of a neo-Nazi is rationalizing hypocrisy. You're doing it every single day. My exit from the movement had a lot to do with that, because it was exhausting to constantly try to reconcile your own hypocrisy. I was active in the neo-Nazi movement from 1987 to 1994. I was drawn into it through neo-Nazi music. There were neo-Nazi skinhead bands from the UK that had found their way to the United States through bootleg tapes and through people importing the records actually from Europe. It excited me because it was so repulsive to civil society. I got into punk because I love to lash out. I love to repulse people. I love to shock people. It's important to understand that punk is a big tent, and it was in the 1980s as well. There are all sorts of different ideologies within the punk scene, and some of them are actually very progressive and actually very leftist and activist oriented. But in my case, I saw punk as just smashing things and shocking people, and nothing repulses people like a swastika. The band I was in, as well as the gang I was in, operated out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I don't have a lick of musical talent. I can't sing properly, but I could scream really loud back then, and I could get people crazy on stage. I connected with some other neo-Nazis from Toronto, Canada, and formed Centurion. And Centurion was far and away the most successful white power band I was involved with. We had sold 20,000 CDs within 6 months or so of releasing it. And I actually still get hate mail from Centurion fans who are just crushed that I am now a race traitor. And they somehow reconcile it still, that I still love Centurion, it's still a great band. Our imagery was incredibly hyper-violent, incredibly hyper anti-Semitic and racist, and the more shocking it could be, the better we liked it. And we thought that was awesome. We were like, our music is so hateful and so violent that our own audience tears itself apart when they hear it. The goal of the band was to spread the ideology through music. And if you can get a recording of it as you're driving around in your car with a cassette tape or later CDs, you can practice the ideology throughout the day as you're going about your business. It's important to understand that there is a real element of practice here, in that to be a neo-Nazi, you have to be in a constant state of fear. You have to be in a constant state of anger. Neo-Nazis aren't like the most contemplative, meditative people. They need some sort of device in order to practice the hate, and that's what that music was. The people who attended our concerts later on especially were typically other affiliated white nationalist skinheads. People who were already parts of skinhead gangs, who were very familiar with the whole process of white power music. They listened to it all the time. We were one of many, many white power bands out there. Typically, if there was a potential recruit, they would get brought along to one of these concerts. And it was a really powerful thing for a recruit to see. The exhaustion came from all sorts of directions. There were times as I was committing acts of violence that I had this inner voice saying, why are you doing this? This is wrong. And I had to expend a lot of energy to suppress that voice for 7 years. It was exhausting to cut myself off from pop culture that I took for granted my entire life. I've always been a huge TV, movies, music, sports geek, and when you're a neo-Nazi, all of those things are forbidden. They're all seen as Jewish propaganda to corrupt the will of the white man to make him easier to oppress. Whether you're talking about the Green Bay Packers, or you're talking about Hollywood movies, or a sitcom on TV. So I would sneak away to watch a Packer game on Sundays, knowing that if my guys caught me doing this, they'd see me as complicit in the destruction of the white race. We talked about hypocrisy. This is like one of the daily aspects of hypocrisy that I have to do mental gymnastics to navigate around. That takes a lot of energy. It's exhausting. The hate itself is exhausting from an addiction standpoint. I'm an alcoholic. I drank profusely from the time I was 14 until I was 34. I'm 54 now. So I drank for 20 years straight. And especially toward the end, There were days where I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired of it. Hate's the same way. When you're going through your life in constant fear of everyone who doesn't look like you and everyone who doesn't think like you get sick and tired of it. What was most exhausting, though, was when people I claimed to hate treated me with kindness. And I was very fortunate that time and time again, throughout the 7-year span that I was in neo-Nazi hate groups, there were people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Afro-American, Latino, and Asian coworkers who treated me with kindness when I least deserved it, but when I needed it most. And in doing so, they demonstrated for me, first of all, like how a human being should treat another human being, and second of all, a glimpse of the life I could be leading if I just set all this nonsense ideology aside. That was the final straw and the exhaustion that led me to 1994, when I was literally looking for an excuse to get out. For 7 years of my life, and the most formative years of my life, from the time I was 16 until I was 23, when a normal person would be going to college and deciding on a career and what motivates them and what they love. I was just immersed in this hate and violence. And within the movement, I had developed a bit of status. I was a street fighter. I was a lead singer in this band. I had groupies. I was a reverend in a racial holy war. I was one of the founding members of Hammerskin Nation. In real life, I'm an alcoholic, high school dropout, who's too much of a drunk to pay his bills, has to keep moving back to mom and dad's house. Like, that was real life. And it was an intimidating prospect to give up all of this, albeit false status, and face the cruel reality of the hole I had dug for myself. And I needed something drastic to happen in order to kind of push me over those last couple steps. What happened was early in 1994, the mother of my daughter and I broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and a woman. And I found myself a single parent to our 18-month-old daughter. A couple months after that, after a concert my band had played, a second friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight. And by that time, I had lost count of how many friends had been incarcerated. So it finally hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. And that was the excuse I needed to walk away from the movement. When I first left, I had this sense of elation and this sense of freedom. I can hang out with whoever I want to hang out with now. I can watch the Packers. I can watch Seinfeld. I can go to the movies without feeling like a race traitor. Just all those things felt amazing. There weren't a whole lot of immediate consequences when I first left, because by the time I left, what was once a pretty large group of people had splintered into all these separate groups that were very disparate and not talking to each other. So really, by the time I left, the only people I hung out with were the guys in my band and a couple other older guys who we called the inner circle. There were other guys who did a complete 180 like me and were very outspoken against the movement. There were other guys who were still kind of they had some of the ideas, but for the most, they worked with a diverse group and they liked their coworkers. They were able to get along with the rest of the people in the world and function as adults. And so because most of the other guys were as burnt out as I was, there wasn't a lot of blowback when I left. In my case, my de-radicalization process was the Midwest rave scene. Within a year and a half of leaving the hate group, I found myself on the south side of Chicago, 4 in the morning on Sunday, shaking my to house music with 3,000 people of every possible ethnicity, socioeconomic background, gender identity, sexual orientation, and loving every minute of it. And that very much took over and filled those needs of identity, purpose, and belonging. In the rave scene of the 90s, their mantra was peace, love, unity, and respect. The street violence we engaged in back in the 80s and 90s has morphed into mass casualty violence today. On August 5th of 2012, a neo-Nazi skinhead who was part of the gang that I was involved with attacked the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and he ended up murdering 7 people. At the time, that was the worst attack by an affiliated white nationalist since the 1960s, when the Ku Klux Klan killed 4 little girls in Alabama with a bomb that was meant for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Tragically, since August 5th, 2012, there have been almost too many other white nationalist attacks to count, including the attack at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where 9 people were killed by a young man who was radicalized into white nationalism online. Going from there, there were attacks in El Paso, in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue. There was a horrible attack in Buffalo at a supermarket, and on and on. I'm ashamed to not remember every specific one, but there have been so many that it's hard to even keep track of them without a reference source. And I do believe that the frequency and the scale of these attacks feed upon each other. Another kind of milestone amongst these white nationalist attacks were the attacks in Norway, where he set a bomb in Oslo at the Labour Party headquarters that killed 8 people, and then he drove to a youth camp on Utøya Island and murdered 69 more people with firearms, most of whom were teenagers. Today, these attacks are typically perpetrated by a quote-unquote lone wolf attacker. It's usually the wallflowers in these groups, the guys that don't stand out, the guys that even though they're a part of the group, people don't really take them seriously, people don't pay a lot of attention to them. Those are the guys, the affiliated guys, who are going to commit these types of atrocities. Unfortunately, I think today's society is a very ripe breeding ground for race-based hate, because race is so at the forefront of all of our social discourse. When Joe Pissed Off White Kid is being branded as white at his school and then told he has all this oppressor colonizer privilege, that's steps 1 and 2 to creating a white nationalist. There's no middle ground for that kid. There's no room for him to say, you know what, I'm a human being. Yeah, I might be racialized as white, and of course there's all sorts of social issues we need to talk about as far as that goes, but that's not who I am. Until there's middle ground, neo-Nazi groups are going to go to town with us. And I'm happy to see that more and more people understand that. And they understand that discussion and creating that middle ground is really how we fight racism. There's no social media platform that is proof against hate happening on it. And obviously neo-Nazi groups are well aware that a screen is an amazing tool for them to connect and to recruit. It's going to have the potential to be extremely harmful and extremely toxic. Of the existing platforms today of consequence, there's 4chan, 8chan, there's all sorts of obscure things where people meet and have these kinds of discussions and these ideologies propagate. But of the big ones, I think X is obviously first and foremost. It's a hotbed for people to be openly racist and openly hateful. I happen to think the most dangerous ones are the ones that are linked to video gaming, Discord, like actual platforms that are meant for gaming and like getting together to, what Call of Duty map are we going to play? These are places where white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and all sorts of other violent extremist ideologies can propagate and recruit, and it's something that parents need to be very aware of. I'm a big fan of a man named Jonathan Haidt, who is kind of at the forefront of getting kids to get off of social media and get back to the real world. And I think that that's really the answer, not only to diminish the power of neo-Nazi groups, but to diminish the power of these screens entirely on the hold they have on us as human beings. We certainly have the power and the capacity to completely diminish the power and even the existence of neo-Nazi groups as a whole. In the United States, it's not illegal to hold neo-Nazi beliefs. And I'm actually a strong proponent of the First Amendment. I don't believe that anti-hate speech laws are effective. And this knowledge is based on my experience working internationally. So I do think that free speech is very much a pressure valve, and that restricting speech is not an effective means of diminishing hate in our society. I've seen countermeasures against hate by governments that can be very effective. I've done a lot of work in Scandinavia, namely Denmark and Norway. I've been to Sweden once and did some of the work there, but they spend a lot of money in providing things for young people to do, like healthy things for young people to get together and do. And I think we in the States could do a better job of that. I'm very mindful of the harm that I did as a white nationalist. Every day I'm mindful of that harm. And my method of accountability is to actively work to get kids out of these hate groups nowadays, as well as to put a message out there, as I'm doing on your show here, that it's not only possible to change your life around, it's awesome to change your life around. Life is so much better and so much happier when you're not burdened by hate every waking moment of your day. So everything I can do to put that message out into society, I'm going to do that. And I do that all motivated by the harm that I committed in those days. Nowadays, I work for a group called Parents for Peace, where we coach families who have a radicalized loved one into any form of violent extremism. And we coach them on how to best deal with that loved one to guide them to a healthier place. We also work directly with the radicalized individuals to try to get them on a healthier path. And the way we do that is, ironically, the same way that I recruited Joe Pissed Off White Kid back in the day, which is to find that underlying pain point that's driving their affinity for this hateful ideology. If it is not having a girlfriend, or they don't have a good job, or whatever, it's typically they don't feel that they matter. They don't feel that they're important. We help them develop a healthy sense of self-worth. That's how de-radicalization works, is you getting them out of the movement or out of whatever group they're in is obviously step one. It's hard to proceed beyond that if you don't take that step. But once that step is taken, that's when the real work begins, to address, like, what are the issues that drove me to this in the first place. At Parents for Peace, we see violent extremism as a public health issue, certainly not a political issue. The same way alcoholism is a public health issue, the same way domestic violence is, the same way HIV/AIDS is a public health issue. If you look at HIV, when it first came about in the 80s, it was extremely stigmatized. It was also extremely politicized. You only got AIDS if you did horrible, sinful things. It only happened to people who deserved it. Nowadays, thank God, we see HIV as the public health issue that it is. It's something we all need to be concerned about. It's something anybody can get. We have to see it as something that we all need to be active in treating and healing in our society. When you look at violent extremism in that same lens, anyone can become a violent extremist, anyone can be a victim of violent extremism. It's not restricted to any certain demographic. I've written 2 books. My first book's called My Life After Hate. I'm actually in the process of a new version of My Life After Hate, which is like a memoir about my time in the movement, but also everything I've done over the past 15 years. My second book was called The Gift of Our Wounds. I wrote that with Pardeep Singh Kalika and Robin Gabby Fisher. Pardeep's father, Satwant, was killed in the Sikh temple shooting of August 5th, 2012. Pardeep reached out to me a couple months after the shooting. Him and I sat down and had dinner and became very dear friends and brothers to this day. We've done a lot of work together and we'll continue to do a lot of work together. And the book is basically our 2 intersecting stories. Every day I'm grateful to not be who I was 30 years ago. Every day I experience joy just walking down the street. We're shooting this in New York City, which is one of my favorite places on earth, because I can walk down a block and hear 5 different languages and see people from all over the world. And it's never lost on me that back in the day, I would have been terrified to walk down that same block. All people want to be happy. All people want to be safe. All people just want to live their lives. They want to experience love. And when we can get that through our heads, it makes our own lives so much more of a rewarding process, and it also enriches the world around us.
Hi, I'm a producer and Authorized account. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment with more topics that you'd like us to cover in this series.